The wind, a relentless sculptor of the barren plains, whispered tales of forgotten dreams through the cracks of Gold Creek, a frontier town where the very air tasted of grit and the iron tang of desperation. Here, sunlight bleached the colors from existence, leaving behind a stark canvas of survival. She, whose name once held the delicate cadence of a distant memory, was now simply the bride, a designation as rigid and cold as the chains that bound her spirit. The journey across half a continent had been a relentless march into the unknown, driven by the deceptive flicker of a promise in a faded newspaper advertisement, a fresh start, a new life, far from the suffocating shadows of a past she yearned to shed. But the reality that greeted her was a brutal awakening. Jebediah, her intended, possessed eyes like polished stones, reflecting only the flat, emotionless stare of a predatory creature. His hands, thick and calloused, spoke of more than just honest toil, and his breath, a sour miasma of stale whiskey and unspoken brutalities, seemed to choke the very air around her. The ceremony, a crude parody of sacred vows, was less a union and more a transaction, witnessed by a handful of faces etched with the harsh lines of survival, their gazes devoid of pity, reflecting only a raw, primal understanding of the brutal necessities of this untamed world. Each shallow breath she took felt like a betrayal, a concession to the suffocating fate unfolding before her. This was not the freedom she had craved. It was a deeper, more insidious cage, a slow suffocation of the spirit. Yet beneath the rising tide of despair, a spark of defiance flickered, stubborn and incandescent. It was not a reasoned choice, but an instinct, a desperate, defiant lurch against the dying of the light, a silent vow that she would not surrender her essence to this desolate landscape or the man who sought to claim her. This land demanded submission, but her soul, bruised yet unbroken, whispered of resistance, of a truth within her that refused to be silenced, even as the shadow of her impending doom loomed. The silence of the gathered crowd pressed in, heavier than any physical weight. Yet it was in this oppressive quiet that the decision forged itself, a fragile, defiant ember in the howling wilderness of her despair. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The question, when it came, was not a plea but a guttural command, an echo of the crude man who uttered it. Will you take this man? The words hung heavy, a shroud over the oppressive silence of the dusty street. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat like a trapped bird. Every instinct screamed. Every fiber of her being recoiled from Jebediah's gaze, which promised nothing but a lifetime of chilling emptiness. She had journeyed across a continent, endured gnawing hunger and the sting of poverty, but a deeper hunger, for self-preservation, now roared within her. To say yes would be to bury herself alive, to extinguish the last embers of her soul. With a strength she did not know she possessed, a fragile thread of defiance spun from the deepest well of her being. She shook her head, a single, almost imperceptible tremor, yet it rippled through the gathered onlookers like a stone cast into still water. A collective gasp, then a murmur, a low hum of disbelief and outrage. Jebediah's face, already a roadmap of harsh lines, contorted into a mask of livid fury, his eyes narrowing to slits of pure venom. "You dare?" he spat, his voice cracking the brittle silence. The town elder, a man whose face was a testament to sun-baked judgment, stepped forward, his expression hardening. "This is not how things are done, woman. You made your agreement. You cannot defy the word of a man." His voice, though calm, held the weight of immutable law, of a social order as unforgiving as the land itself. The whispers grew louder, transforming into a chorus of condemnation. "Unnatural," hissed one woman, her face a tightened knot of self-righteous indignation. "A harlot," muttered another, eyes gleaming with a perverse satisfaction. The air vibrated with their judgment, a collective weight pressing down, stripping her of dignity, her very humanity. Her defiance, a defiant flag raised against an overwhelming storm, ignited fierce, immediate retribution. Jebediah, fueled by wounded pride and the implicit consent of the crowd, grabbed her arm, fingers digging into her flesh. He dragged her to the dusty square, where a weathered post stood, a silent witness to countless public shaming. A whip, its leather straps worn smooth from use, materialized in his hand, a chilling extension of his rage. The first lash cut through the stillness, a sharp, searing ribbon of pain across her back, ripping through the thin fabric of her dress. A gasp escaped her lips, quickly stifled, replaced by a ragged breath that refused to become a sob. She would not give them that satisfaction. Each subsequent strike tore not just at her skin, but at the very fabric of hope, exposing the raw, bleeding truth of her powerlessness. Yet each agonizing blow also hardened a core of resolve within her, a silent vow to endure. The world narrowed to the sting of the whip, the jeering faces, and the raw, desperate beating of her own heart. The dust motes danced in the merciless sunlight, indifferent spectators. The relentless descent of the whip was a rhythmic assault, each crack a hammer blow against the fragile fortress of her consciousness. Her vision blurred, the faces of the townspeople swirling into a grotesque tableau of malice and indifference. The pain was a living thing, coiling around her, demanding surrender. Yet deeper still, a stubborn ember glowed, a refusal to break. This was the end, she thought, the final brutal chapter of a life defined by struggle. It was in this abyss of despair, when all seemed lost, when her body trembled on the verge of collapse, that a tremor, subtle yet undeniable, ran through the hostile crowd. A hush, immediate and absolute, fell over the square, silencing the jeers, stilling the whip in Jebediah's raised hand. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, charged with a primal tension that tightened every nerve. Her eyes, clouded with pain and exhaustion, slowly lifted, following the collective gaze of the townspeople. And then she saw him. Standing at the edge of the square, framed by the blinding intensity of the afternoon sun, was a figure unlike any she had ever witnessed. Tall and lean, his silhouette was stark against the sky, his long, dark hair braided with feathers that seemed to catch the light. His face, etched with the stoic dignity of the earth itself, bore markings that spoke of a heritage both ancient and formidable. He wore buckskin, adorned with intricate beadwork, each stitch a testament to a world beyond Gold Creek. He was an anomaly, a whisper of wilderness in a place that strove to tame all that was wild. He moved then, with a fluid grace that seemed to defy the dust and the weight of the moment, his moccasined feet making no sound. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept across the scene, lingering for only a fraction of a second on her battered form, then settling with an unwavering intensity on Jebediah. There was no aggression in his posture, only an immense, palpable presence that commanded attention. Jebediah, usually so emboldened, seemed to shrink under that gaze, his hand, still clutching the whip, trembling imperceptibly. Without a single word, the brave reached out, his hand closing around her arm with a firm, protective grip. It was not a violent claim, but a gentle, undeniable reclamation. The crowd remained frozen, caught between fear and a bewildered awe. He pulled her free from the post, detaching her from the nightmare, and turned, leading her away from the gaping mouths and stunned eyes, away from the dust and the judgment. She stumbled, her legs weak, but he held her steady, a silent anchor. The silence followed them, heavy and profound as the Lakota brave took her without a word, a silent defiance against a world that had sought to break her. The journey away from Gold Creek was a blur of raw sensation and disorienting silence. Each jostle of the horse, each flicker of the landscape, sent fresh waves of agony through her ravaged body. Yet the physical pain was almost a comfort, a tangible anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. She rode behind him, his broad back a silent, impenetrable wall, a mystery she dared not yet try to decipher. The air, once thick with the stench of human malice, slowly gave way to the clean, sharp scent of pine and wild sage. The sun, which had been a harsh, accusing eye in the town square, now cast long, forgiving shadows across the undulating plains. She stole glances at him, the Lakota brave, whose presence had cleaved her from the jaws of a brutal fate. His profile, carved by the elements, was stoic, his gaze fixed on a horizon she could not yet see, a destination she could not fathom. Her mind was a battlefield, warring between gratitude and terror. Had she merely exchanged one cage for another? The white men of Gold Creek saw her as property, a commodity. What did this man, this enigmatic figure from a world utterly alien to her, see? Was she a prize, a burden, a captive? The questions circled like vultures, pecking at the fragile edges of her terrifying new freedom. There was no common language, only the vast expanse of their cultural chasm. Yet in his quiet strength, in the way he effortlessly navigated the rugged terrain, she sensed a groundedness, an innate connection to the land that seemed fundamentally different from the frantic, destructive energy of the settlers. His movements were economical, purposeful, devoid of the crude bluster she had come to expect from men. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and crimson, they stopped beside a winding river, its waters glinting like liquid silver. He dismounted with a grace that bordered on the feral, then offered a hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, firm. She slid from the horse, her legs protesting, and sank to the ground, exhaustion washing over her. He built a small, smokeless fire, his movements practiced and efficient, and she watched, mesmerized by the silent ritual. He caught a fish with astonishing speed, cleaned it with an obsidian blade, and roasted it over the flames. He offered her a piece, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. It was not an offer of pity, nor a demand, but a simple, shared act of survival. In that moment, watching the firelight dance in his dark eyes, she felt a profound shift, a subtle loosening of the knots of fear that had constricted her heart, a strange, nascent sense of safety, a fragile hope, blossomed in the vast, wild unknown. The silence of the wilderness enveloped them, a deep, resonant hush. The journey continued, a silent passage through a landscape that shifted from harsh plains to rolling hills crowned with ancient cedars, finally leading them to a hidden valley, cradled by towering rock formations. There, nestled against the earth, was a village of conical lodges, their smoke spiraling skyward like silent prayers. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the rich, earthy aroma of life lived close to the land. This was the heart of the Lakota world, a place of stark contrasts to the crude settlements of the white man. Her arrival was met with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Dark eyes, sharp and assessing, followed her every move. Women, their faces etched with the wisdom of generations, paused their tasks to watch her, their expressions unreadable. Children, wide-eyed and fearless, peered from behind their mothers' skirts, their innocence a stark reminder of the brutal world she had just left. Kyle, the brave, led her to a lodge at the edge of the village, a dwelling simple yet rich in its adornments of painted hides and woven mats. He spoke a few guttural words to an elder woman, whose eyes, ancient and knowing, seemed to pierce straight through her. The woman, Nokomis, the grandmother, nodded slowly, then gestured for her to enter. There was no question, no argument. It was an unspoken command, a quiet acceptance of Kyle's decision. Inside the lodge, the air was warm, imbued with the lingering scent of past meals and the comforting presence of human warmth. She sat on a thick buffalo robe, her body aching, her mind reeling from the sheer strangeness of it all. This was not the captivity she had envisioned, yet it was not freedom either. It was a profound displacement, a plunge into an existence utterly divorced from everything she knew. Days bled into weeks, each one a slow, meticulous unraveling of her preconceived notions. The Lakota people, often painted as savage brutes in the stories she had heard, were a tapestry of complexities. She witnessed their reverence for the land, their intricate rituals, the deep bonds of family and community. She saw their children, taught not with whips but with stories and patient guidance. She observed Kyle, who was not a master but a protector, a warrior revered for his strength and wisdom. He moved among his people with an effortless authority, his quiet presence a beacon of calm. He rarely spoke to her, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a depth that belied his stoic exterior, a patient understanding that mirrored her own bewildered silence. He brought her food, simple but nourishing, and once a salve for her still healing wounds, applied with a touch so light it was almost a whisper. It was in these quiet moments, observing the intricate dance of their lives, the rhythmic cycles of hunting and gathering, of storytelling and ceremony, that the rigid walls of her fear began to subtly crack. A stark authenticity, a raw honesty, vibrated through the very earth beneath her feet. The initial weeks were a slow, hesitant dance of observation and tentative assimilation. She learned to discern the subtle shifts in the village's rhythm, the silent language of gestures and glances that conveyed more than any spoken word. Her wounds, both visible and unseen, began to mend under Nokomis's watchful eye, who treated her with a gruff kindness, offering herbal poultices and a silence more comforting than sympathy. Ilara, though still guarded, found herself drawn to the communal tasks, the women weaving intricate baskets, preparing hides, or grinding corn. She offered what little she could, her clumsy attempts met with patient smiles rather than scorn. The quiet acceptance, a stark contrast to the judgment she had known, was a balm to her wounded spirit. Kyle remained an enigma, a figure of silent strength. He would often pass by her lodge, his shadow falling across the entrance, and she would feel his gaze, a weightless presence that was neither intrusive nor indifferent. One afternoon, while she struggled with a stubbornly tangled fishing net, he knelt beside her, his hands strong and deft, untangling the knots with practiced ease. There was no instruction, no lecture, just a shared moment of silent effort. Their hands brushed, an electric jolt, and for a fleeting second his eyes met hers, holding a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, recognition perhaps, or a shared understanding that transcended words. In that moment, the vast chasm between their worlds seemed to narrow, bridged by a shared humanity. She began to perceive the nuances of his silent strength, his quiet dedication to his people. He was not a man of grand pronouncements, but of unwavering action. She saw him leading hunting parties, his movements precise and respectful of the prey. She witnessed him mediating disputes, his voice low and calm, his wisdom guiding his people towards harmony. He possessed a dignity that resonated deeply, a stark contrast to the crude bluster of the men in Gold Creek, who equated masculinity with dominance and cruelty. The irony was not lost on her. She had been rescued by a man labeled a savage, only to find in him a depth of character and a moral compass far truer than any she had encountered in her own world. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of a childhood spent in a cramped, dark city, where freedom was an illusion and kindness a rare, fragile flower. Here, amidst the vastness of the plains, under the immense, watchful sky, she felt a different kind of pressure, the pressure of truth, of authenticity. She was learning to breathe again, not just air, but life itself. The wound on her back, once a searing brand of shame, was now a fading mark, a reminder of what she had endured, but also a testament to her survival, a silent narrative etched onto her skin. The Lakota people, through their quiet reverence for the earth and profound sense of community, were slowly teaching her a new way of seeing, a new way of being, one that held the promise of healing, not just for her body, but for her very soul. The slow dance of cultural immersion continued, subtly eroding the rigid lines she had drawn between them and us. It was a gradual awakening, like the first tentative shoots pushing through frozen earth. She began to pick up fragments of their language, sounds blending with sharp, resonant syllables, a language rooted in the earth itself. One evening, under a sky ablaze with countless stars, Kyle sat by the communal fire, his voice low, recounting a story. Though she understood only a few words, the emotion in his tone, the gestures of his hands, spoke volumes. It was a tale of betrayal, of broken promises, of a time when the white settlers had come, not seeking harmony, but land, gold, and dominance. Later, as the village slept under the watchful moon, Kyle approached her lodge. He didn't enter, but waited, a silent sentinel. She emerged, a question in her eyes. His gaze was distant, etched with a melancholy she hadn't seen before. "They came," he said, his voice a low rumble, the words precise, though strained, as if plucked from a deep well of pain. "To my sister. She was like you, alone. They took her from the river. I saw. I was a boy, helpless." His voice faltered, raw with a grief that spanned years. "I watched them, the men of the iron horses. They did not whip her. They did worse. They shamed her. They broke her spirit, then left her to die." A tremor ran through his powerful frame. "When I saw you, in the square, it was her. I could not let it happen again. I could not be helpless again." The confession hung in the cold night air, a raw, bleeding wound exposed under the vast, uncaring sky. It was a truth that resonated with her own pain, a shared history of violation and powerlessness. Yet his was laced with the bitterness of a profound, unresolved guilt. His stoicism, she realized, was not a mask of indifference, but a shield against a pain too deep to bear. His act of salvation in Gold Creek was not mere heroism, but a desperate attempt at redemption, a silent battle against the ghosts of his past. He was flawed, yes, burdened by a wound that mirrored her own, yet his flaw was born of compassion, of a desperate need to undo a past failure. The revelation bound them, a fragile thread spun from shared sorrow, and a desperate unspoken need for healing. But this newfound understanding came with a heavy weight. The quiet of the village had always been a deceptive calm. Whispers of encroaching settlers, of tensions rising at the edges of their traditional lands, had been growing louder, like a distant thunder. The white men, emboldened by their numbers and their hunger for territory, were not content with Gold Creek. Their gaze was now fixed on the very valley where the Lakota had sought refuge, a valley they called home. The peace, she knew, was a fragile illusion, and soon, the fragile bonds forming between her and this people would be tested by a storm far greater than any she had yet faced. The revelation of Cale's past, a raw, exposed nerve of collective trauma and personal grief, had woven a new, fragile thread between them, yet it also sharpened the edges of the escalating external threat. The whispers about encroaching settlers were no longer mere rumors. They were becoming tangible, threatening vibrations in the earth. Scouts returned with grim faces, reporting increased sightings of prospectors and surveyors marking lines on land that had always been free. The fragile peace of the valley felt increasingly tenuous, a delicate membrane stretched taut against the growing pressure of an inevitable clash. Ilara found herself caught in a new kind of tension, a collective anxiety that permeated the very air of the village. She was no longer just an outsider, but a witness, and perhaps by her very presence, a symbol of the conflict. The elders gathered frequently in the council lodge, their voices low and grave, discussing strategies, weighing options against the encroaching tide. Cale, always present, his quiet authority a steady anchor, spoke little, but his gaze, when it met Ilara's, held a stark, unspoken truth. Their world was shrinking, and the choice between peace and war was no longer theirs to make. The tension manifested in subtle ways. Young warriors practicing their skills, women gathering provisions with quiet urgency, children playing closer to the lodges, their laughter sometimes hushed. The sense of belonging Ilara had cautiously begun to cultivate was now laced with a profound dread, the understanding that this sanctuary, her unlikely haven, was under siege. One morning, the dread materialized into stark reality. A small band of armed white men, led by a man with a cruel, familiar glint in his eye, rode to the very edge of the valley, their presence a deliberate provocation. They made demands, their voices amplified by the open air, accusing the Lakota of harboring a runaway, of theft, of defiance. Their words, though directed at the tribal leaders, felt like a direct assault on Ilara, a phantom whip cracking in the air, reminding her of the public shaming she had endured. They demanded her return, claiming her as property, a fugitive from their twisted justice. Cale stood at the front of the gathered Lakota, his posture unyielding, a silent fortress against the aggression. His voice, when it finally broke the tense standoff, was calm, resonant, carrying across the clearing. "She is not yours," he stated, the simple words imbued with generations of defiance. The white leader scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "She is a white woman, runaway. You have no claim here, savage." The insult hung heavy, a challenge that reverberated through the valley. It was a moment of stark choice, not just for Cale and his people, but for Ilara herself. Would she remain silent, a passive object, or would she find her voice, her agency, in this crucible of escalating conflict? The land, once her refuge, now demanded her allegiance, asking her to choose a side in a battle that was far older than her own arrival. The white leader's sneer hung in the air, a poisonous cloud, and the silence that followed was thick with menace. Ilara felt a surge of familiar terror, a cold knot tightening in her stomach, echoing the public square. But this time, it was different. She was not alone. Kyle stood beside her, a bulwark of quiet strength, and behind him, the stoic faces of the Lakota people, their collective gaze unwavering. She remembered the sting of the whip, the humiliation, the utter powerlessness. She remembered Cale's hand, reaching out, pulling her from the abyss. In that moment, the fear transformed, transmuted into a defiant fire. She stepped forward, a single, deliberate stride, placing herself slightly in front of Kyle, directly facing the sneering leader. Her movement was unexpected, drawing gasps from both sides. The white men exchanged confused glances, their bravado momentarily faltering. Her voice, when it came, was soft at first, a whisper against the vastness, but it gained strength with each word, resonating with a clarity born of absolute conviction. "I am no one's property," she declared, her gaze piercing, unwavering. "I am a woman. I chose to leave their ways. I choose to stand here." Her eyes swept across the faces of the white men, then to the Lakota, then back to the leader, whose face now held a mixture of shock and renewed contempt. "They called me chattel. They whipped me for daring to possess my own will. These people," she gestured vaguely to the Lakota behind her, "these people gave me shelter, treated me with dignity. They did not claim me. They accepted me." The leader's sneer returned, colder now, laced with a venomous intent. "This is not your place, woman. You are a white woman. You belong with your own kind." He raised his hand, a silent signal to his armed men. The air crackled, taut as a bowstring, poised for violence. Gale's hand, unseen by the white men, touched her arm. A silent question, a recognition of the danger. She met his gaze, and in his eyes she saw profound respect. She nodded, imperceptibly, a confirmation. Her decision was made. Suddenly, a young Lakota warrior, swift as a shadow, dashed forward, not towards the white men but towards the valley's entrance. A single arrow, fletched with eagle feathers, was loosed, not at the men but over their heads, embedding itself with a sharp thud into a distant tree. It was a warning, a declaration of intent. Kyle stepped forward, drawing his own bow, not aiming, but holding it steady, a silent threat. The leader, startled, weighed his options. The Lakota were not backing down. With a frustrated curse, he barked orders. "We'll be back," he snarled, eyes burning with malice, directed solely at Alara. "You cannot hide forever." Then, wheeling their horses around, they rode off, leaving a lingering dust cloud and the acrid stench of retreating hatred. The immediate threat was gone, but the promise of future conflict hung heavy in the air. The valley was safe for now, but the battle for freedom had only just begun. The dust settled, slow and heavy, a metaphor for the profound silence that descended upon the Lakota village. The tension, though no longer acutely violent, lingered like a phantom limb, a deep ache beneath the surface of the quiet. The white men had retreated, but their promise to return, sharp and venomous, echoed in the stillness of the valley. Alara stood, trembling slightly, but with a new spine of steel. She had spoken, not merely against her tormentors, but for herself, for her chosen path, for the inherent dignity she had discovered in this wild, unforgiving land. Cale stood beside her, his presence a comforting weight, his eyes reflecting a quiet pride, a shared understanding of the moment's gravity. In the days that followed, the immediate threat subsided, replaced by a vigilant calm. The Lakota people, their faces still etched with the seriousness of the encounter, moved with renewed purpose. They saw her differently now, not just as the strange woman Cale had brought, but as one who had chosen to stand with them, whose spirit resonated with their own struggle for survival and identity. Nokomis, the elder grandmother, approached her one evening, her ancient eyes soft, her hand reaching out to grasp Alara's. "You have found your voice," she murmured, her words a gentle benediction, "and your heart. You are of the land now." It was not an adoption, but an acknowledgement, a profound acceptance that transcended bloodlines. Alara felt tears sting her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a quiet, overwhelming gratitude. Her life within the Lakota community found a new rhythm, woven deeply into the fabric of their existence. She learned more of their ways, their stories, their spiritual connection to the earth and the sky. She learned to hunt, to track, to read the subtle signs of the wild. She learned to mend, to weave, to prepare food in ways that honored the gifts of the land. The simple acts were imbued with meaning, each task a meditation, each moment a lesson in true living. Kyle remained her silent anchor, his presence a steady, unspoken promise. Their connection deepened, not through effusive words, but through shared glances, mutual respect, and the profound understanding that only those who have faced the abyss together can truly comprehend. There was no need for conventional declarations. Their bond was etched into the vastness of the plains, held firm by the spirit of the wind and the enduring strength of the earth. The future remained uncertain, shadowed by the ever-present threat of encroaching civilization, a tide that could not be turned back. The Lakota people knew their fight was far from over. But in that moment, under the boundless sky, surrounded by the quiet resilience of a people who clung to their traditions with an unbreakable spirit, Ilara found not just a refuge, but a profound sense of belonging. She was no longer the mail-order bride, adrift and unmoored. She was Ilara, a woman forged by pain and tempered by courage, standing on the edge of a new horizon, her heart filled with a quiet hope for a future she would fight to define, not as a victim, but as a warrior of her own choosing.